We are rolling and going free, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very exciting Wednesday because we have an actual highbrow intellectual to bring on to discuss a new book with us. And without further ado, the esteemed Dr. Joseph Ford Cotto. Brother, how are you doing?
Very well, Jason. Thank you very much for having me on your program.
Oh my God, it's my absolute pleasure. And when I saw that you had a new book and and I began reading through, I was really, I have to say, I'm a lover of the English language, and so not only is your new book "What Happened to America," and I think that's just an absolutely, and we'll put it up on the screen here as well, folks. But by the way, folks, just if you can, please give a like and share this stream everywhere that you can on your social media. Retweet it, regab it, post it again on Facebook. We are under severe censorship and even on Twitter. So don't take it for granted that Elon Musk owns it. Even on Twitter, we're under severe censorship. So please retweet, gab, and post this everywhere you can. And just as always is the case, you can communicate with me on all of the different platforms, including both locations on Twitter during this stream, as well as all of the others, obviously, including YouTube. Just make sure you tag me as No White Guilt. But I got to say, when I dug in, the title is fantastic. What Happened to America and Why the American Dream Became a Nightmare. How and why the American Dream became a nightmare. And it really is, it struck me as and I don't want to say too much about it without just letting you have the ball and then maybe introducing it. And before, though, we get to specifically the book itself, a little bit about yourself, if you could. But I just wanted to say up front, and I'll probably end up repeating it because I was enamored when I began reading your book. And I saw not only is it facts based, it's intellectual, but you also have a flair and an adroitness with the English language. So there's a bit of poetry with the prose and the data, and I can really appreciate that. But before we get started, there are going to be people here that don't know who you are, if you can believe it or not. So maybe if you could give a little synopsis about yourself and bring people on board with who you are and what you do, and the that you do. Should you still do shows with the storied and lionized Paul Gottfried?
As a matter of fact, he and I just did a show yesterday, but we no longer co-host. I have him as a guest on my program, which is it's different than Cotto Gottfried, which we would co-host. The new program is called News Site, as in getting insight on news, and it airs on Twitter, now called X. People can find it on my account. There's always an episode pinned there. It is obviously live streamed to the account, but most people see it over the next 2 or so weeks, at least after I start putting the episodes in, as I call it, rotation, because sometimes it takes several weeks to over a month before that happens. But I'm pleased to say that the viewership on Twitter/X is outstanding, infinitely better than YouTube. For any shadow ban that goes on Twitter, it's not as severe as YouTube. I used to do Cotto Gottfried with Paul, as many will recall, on YouTube. So I definitely can compare both platforms. But I obviously do that show. Now I have the subscription feature on Twitter. I do insight on news items and cultural phenomena, so people can subscribe to that for $3 a month. If they're on X, Twitter, whatever. And I really like focusing on history because it gives us a great deal of insight about not only the present, but the future. And so to present history to the public in a way that's accessible and factual and relevant to their concerns, that's a really big deal for me. I've written several books about history. What Happened to America is the latest, obviously, but it's, I would dare say, the most important because it's, I think, the most comprehensive about modern America, and it does explain how modern America got to be such an excrement show. I am a doctor of business administration. That really has nothing to do with my assessments of history, Although I will say that in training to be a doctor of business administration, you certainly look a lot at facts and figures and you compile data. So maybe actually you could say that does relate to my assessments of history. But I was writing about history long before I became a DBA. So that is, I mean, that's the relevant stuff about me. Oh, and one other thing that some people often find interesting. You often see, if you read anything about me, Baron Cotto. That's because the late king of Rwanda bestowed a hereditary barony upon me, and before that, a knighthood. He was an outstanding gentleman. Even though he was, obviously a sub-Saharan African, he was very much in his nature a man of the West. He was very much assimilated to Belgian customs. So a fascinating fellow, to say the absolute least, and it's a high honor to have received awards from him. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But that's my background. In addition, just one last thing, I did a lot of journalism work in years gone by. So I gained a decent insight of how the media functions. And that made me and inspired me to start my own show and to write my own pieces. It's good to get your stuff out there unfiltered, because the media's filter is highly disagreeable, put mildly.
Yeah, without question. That's kind of a almost either you are benefiting from the victimization that the media inflicts on the population, and therefore you enjoy the media, or you are everyone else. And that's obviously, we just have to, the challenge is how to deal with it. And I imagine, if I could, before we actually dig in, and we have Joseph for an hour here today, and I don't expect we'll get through all of the book, maybe, but I don't expect
if it goes a little beyond an hour, that's perfectly fine.
Yes. Well, I mean, I was going to say, if you'd be okay, I'd like to have you back too, to finish up whatever we don't get to, so we could have another reason to bring you back.
Outstanding. And I'd very much like to see you on my show, as I mentioned earlier.
Happily we'll show up whenever we can make it happen. The sooner the better.
Absolutely.
So I do want to dig in just to the topic with the question of what really motivated you to get started on this particular book.
Well, obviously, my discontent with modern America, that's one hell of a motivator. And I really wanted to address this from something other than a point of view of, Biden did this today and it's terrible, or some establishment Republicans proposing this and it's awful. I wanted to get into the history of what brought us to this truly degenerate point. And in order to do that, I had to go way back to history, into the colonial period. And I had to do this in a way that I could put into a book that was less than 250 pages, because beyond 250 pages, a lot of people zone out. And I wanted to make the text pretty big, so people wouldn't, sort of get lost page to page. The idea is to make a very readable book, and at the same time cover such a wide, vast swath of history. So it was not the easiest of things to get the book together. A lot of facts had to be uncovered from old sources. I mean, really old sources, the sort of stuff that would not be printed today. But I did manage to get my hands on it. I had known about this stuff for years. I just never compiled it into a book. But it was something that I was determined to do, because people are very distraught. They're very angry. They're very confused. They don't know why what's going on is going on. And in a lot of cases, they wind up believing either stupid things or outright destructive things. And they do not get the facts of the matter. And as such, that means they're almost certain to create a negative future, not only for themselves, but for others going forward. So I really wanted to write a book that was honest, that was factual, that would present the history of America as it pertains to our present situation in a way that people would relate to. So it's born out of my own frustration with the way things are going, and the way they've been going for some time. But I also did it sort of in the mindset of public service, so others could come to learn the facts of history and hopefully use them to gain a better understanding of the present and build a brighter future.
Brilliantly said. And I feel like, as I was working through the book, that it really is a story, in the way you're tackling the subject, it really is a story about American demographics and the challenges that are resultant of the conflicts with different peoples, and how this really is at the core of a lot of the trouble that we are facing today, as well as in our past, and as a consequence also in our future. Is that accurate to say? Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's just I'm really excited about it. Maybe I'll read
Certainly.
uh, some of the description here for folks, and then we will get in and we'll have you sort of explicate some of each little a chapter if we could. It says, how did America become so screwed up? The answer is probably not what you expect. To find the truth, journey through the tumultuous history of a nation that has weathered storms of epic proportions. From the haunting legacy of chattel slavery to the fiery crucible of the Civil War, there has long been a struggle for unity and identity to shape the American landscape. I really like that. Very powerful. The brother fought brother on as brother fought brother on the battlefield. Families were torn asunder, and the soil of the nation was stained with the blood of countless fallen soldiers. Yet, even in the aftermath of war, healing remained elusive as reconstruction gave way to a turbulent era marked by corruption and blind hatred. The waves of change crashed relentlessly upon America's shores, bringing with them a tide of immigrants whose arrival stirred both hope and fear. Despite the promise of diversity, tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to tear apart the very fabric of American identity. And I think that's really an important point that we're going to be coming back to, like a sewing needle. With the immigration reform of 1965, the nation underwent a transformation, ushering in an era defined by widening divisions and searing resentment. Today, America stands as a fractured mosaic. That's a beautiful way to put it. So true. Its once unified identity splintered into a myriad of factions held together by money and bureaucracy. So absolutely true. In this truly all-American story, explore the rise and descent of a nation whose journey reflects the complexities of human nature and the enduring struggle for unity in the face of adversity. If you want to know how and why America finds itself in such trouble, then get ready for a thought-provoking examination of this nation's past, present, and uncertain future. And just to put a little underscore on folks what I was saying about the writing style, and how if you're a lover of the language, you'll also find the style, Joseph's style, entertaining, and that'll help move you through the text as well. The beginning of the prologue reads as this, just the first two sentences, and it's immediately gripping. In the somber landscape of 2020's America, a land of formerly boundless opportunity and promise finds itself shrouded in the bleak hues of uncertainty and decline. The resonating clamor of division eclipses once resounding calls for unity, leaving a nation adrift in a sea of discontent. And I just want to point out right now at the beginning that the link, the Amazon link for Joseph's book, What Happened to America, is down in the description. You click on that, it'll take you right to the Amazon where you can find the book. And please do get yourself a copy. But Joseph, I feel like we're starting at the starting place. We're starting at the starting line for America, and we're looking at who is America, what is America, and there's all of this opportunity and all of this potential, more importantly, I think, born out of really Anglo-Saxons and Protestants. And I guess just from that point, getting into chapter 1, and I'll just take this blurb and we'll have you work on, we'll open you up and have you work on unpacking. From the wealth of available data, we can craft a vivid picture of the colonial population's national origins as we stand on the cusp of the revolution in 1775. With a total white population of approximately 2 million, a staggering revelation emerges. A staggering 90% hailed from English ancestry, totaling 1.5 million individuals. Moreover, around 300,000 belong to other British stock, leaving less than 200,000 as non-British elements, comprising just over 8% of the populace. I wonder if you might get us started right there, brother. I'm very interested because we like to talk here about the fact that as Westmen, as Westerners, as Western kind, Western countries are created and recreated by us every moment. We're the people who make the West. And so this is the birth of America. And what did your research show you as you put this book together?
Well, my research indicated how important the Anglo-Saxon or English stock is to the story of America. Without that stock, there is no story of America to share. These people, as you mentioned, looking at the statistics, are of indescribable importance. Now, let's not say that they comprise the totality of early American history. They do not. There were others. There were obviously Scottish people, though over time, the Scottish, whether they came from Scotland or Ireland, in which case they were called Ulster Scots or Scots Irish. Eventually, these groups sort of merged in terms of what Americans thought of as Anglo-Saxons. So it became the English and the Scottish who were called Anglo-Saxon. Traditionally, if you see people saying in America, I have an Anglo-Saxon heritage, it means anything British. And obviously the Welsh get thrown in there as well. There's such a small population, they hardly received any airtime at any point in American history. Although here in Central Florida, there is a town called Lake Wales. So at least they got that. But the fact of the matter is that without the English in particular, there would be no America as we know it. The massive Anglo influence is why we have the English language. It's why various buildings in America take their architectural style from England. It's why we have the English model of street building in the United States, which is obviously derived from the Romans. We have so much in America that goes back to England that it's almost it is basically impossible to understate. Even our system of law, common law, comes from England. Here in Florida, as a matter of fact, common law is the statutory law of the state up until 1776, which is ironic because Florida remained loyal to the British crown during the Revolution. It's the only part of what became the U.S. that remained loyal to the crown. But when it became a state, they could have brought a British law up, English common law, up to the 1820s, but they decided in reverence of the U.S., which they were joining, to put it back to the 1770s. So by the way, the people who made Florida a state were Anglo. People often think of Florida as being Spanish, but the people who turned it into a territory and then a state, an American territory and then a state, they were Anglo and to a lesser degree Scottish. And eventually they sort of merged into one people, with the exception of some really rural areas where Scots-Irish heritage continued to be distinctive. But anyway, that's just one example of how important the Anglo heritage is to America. And if you're going to look at its colonial period, there's no question that you cannot divorce Americanism from England and the people of England who came here, and they were known, as I mentioned in the book, as overseas Englishmen. And then they got into this political dispute with Britain, and they decided to make King George the focal point of their hatred, even though he really had nothing to do with their problems. And there was this terrible war between Anglo-Saxons, the overseas Englishmen and the Englishmen who stayed at home. And it was what many people was they referred to as a brother war, and it left damage that goes beyond anything financial or the number of those killed even. It resulted in many Anglos leaving the U.S., the loyalists, and the ones who stayed developed an anti-English sentiment. So they turned on themselves and their heritage, and they adopted the most radical of them French revolutionary ideas about abstract notions of equality and anyone with the will to power being able to turn a situation to their advantage, of what we now call biological concerns, basically an organic view of society that was swiped away by these people who were adherents of, as it's called, the French principles. And these people are basically the forefathers of modern day leftists in America. There was a religious element as well, pietistic Puritanism out of New England, and it's no surprise that a lot of the French revolutionary ideas took root in New England and to a lesser degree other parts of the Northeast. They were not popular in the South at all, and that was something actually that set the stage for the Civil War during the next century. But the Revolutionary War itself set the stage for the Civil War. As I mentioned in the book, it gave credence to the idea of not settling a dispute in a gentlemanly way, as you'd expect Westerners to do who are of high civilization. There was a uniquely American idea of people resorting to violence when it was absolutely unnecessary. And there were many issues before the Civil War with regard to violence or the threat of it. I also write about, not to get too far ahead, but the nullification crisis in South Carolina. The South Carolinian government said, we're not going to listen to this federal tariff law. And then Andrew Jackson said that he would come there and basically destroy them. And so they decided to listen. But the fact of the matter is, America, despite its overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon origin, it's a profoundly divided place going back to that time, wherein Anglos, having once viewed themselves as a united group, overseas Englishmen, they then started to view themselves as a breed apart from their kinfolk on the other side of the Atlantic. And that was a terrible decision because this set up the stage for a slew of conflicts and backstabbing that haunts us to this day.
Well, I was actually cooking this question as you're talking about the Revolutionary War. What sort of effects did that have on the mentality of the Americans and their identity, and severing that connection to that identity, and maybe looking even on that original identity with some, I don't know, opprobrium even, since they waged this war and became this distinct separate entity. And did you find that there was much of that sentiment? And if so, could it have maybe been a sort of like a breeding source of change to come that would be adversarial and detrimental to the identity of early America?
I can answer that by quoting part of the book. This is the part of the book which pertains to the conclusion of the Revolutionary War. Even before the ink dried on the peace treaty, a fateful decision was made that would shape the course of American history: the expulsion of the Loyalists. Aware of the impending consequences, these individuals departed alongside their British allies. From New York alone, approximately 30,000 Loyalists sailed away with the British fleet, while countless others departed from southern ports or trekked overland to Canada. Estimates suggest that the total Loyalist emigration numbered between 60,000 to 70,000 individuals. Remarkably, the Loyalists constituted a distinguished group, boasting many prominent figures and individuals of remarkable courage and steadfastness. Upon resettling, some returned to Britain while others sought refuge in the British West Indies. However, the majority, around 50,000, chose to make Canada their new home. There, they played a pivotal role in shaping their new home's destiny, earning the moniker United Empire Loyalists and laying the foundation for Canada's prosperity. Today, their descendants stand as a testament to their enduring legacy, comprising a vital segment of Canada's population. Yet the departure of these individuals dealt a heavy blow to America's demographic composition. Had they remained, their descendants would likely have numbered over 1.5 million by the 1920s, contributing immeasurably to the nation's development. Coupled with the loss of thousands of lives on both sides during the conflict, the Revolutionary War exacted a staggering human toll on America. I will stop reading there. I did refer to this as the Anglo-Saxon Civil War, and you can see why that is, having looked at the statistics. What happened is that Americans, after the Revolution, as I said, they turned on their own kind. The Loyalists, being in many respects the cream of the crop of American society, went elsewhere. And the people left in America really did not have any desire to ever look at themselves as being overseas Englishmen again. And so then they looked to foreign influences towards cosmopolitanism. They even changed how they dressed, adopting a simpler style And they eventually absorbed the ideas of the French Revolution. Not all of the people who opposed British rule, but certainly the most hardcore of them did. And that set the stage for what we now know as American leftism. Even though the French Revolution was an Enlightenment development, so you can say it was very unenlightened in some of the ways that it was carried out, put mildly. But today's leftism cannot be chalked up to the Enlightenment, but an outgrowth of the Enlightenment, the sort of fanatical French revolutionary aspect, definitely came to America. It caught on and it took on new forms, merged with the pietistic Puritanism of New England, and it formed the basis for what we now call wokeism, or it was called a few years ago social justice warfare. So Americans really did stop viewing themselves as English. They thought of themselves as being superior to the English because they came here to the frontier and they carved out the society, and it gave them this idea that they were a breed apart. Whereas the Spanish, who at that time had a foothold, they got Florida back from Britain after the war because Britain no longer had the money to administer it as a colony. The Spanish just looked at all these Anglos in the U.S. as being Britons who were displaced, and the Spanish, of whom I'm not a fan of their rule in the slightest, but they were correct in this respect because they saw that these people were so similar to these individuals who they're trying so hard to differentiate themselves from, that the harder they tried to differentiate themselves from the folks back in Mother England, the more the English nature of the Americans became apparent. So this created a warped mindset among the Americans after the Revolutionary War, and their terrible treatment of the Loyalists definitely was the bridge to them having this mindset during the years going forward, turning against themselves.
Yeah, it seems like, and it's a really fascinating subject. I mean, it seems like it could be like a whole hour in and of itself. But the war, the Revolutionary War in the United States, seemed, and especially as you're articulating here, to, I guess, inadvertently become a war on our identity as members of certainly the Anglo-Saxons, but then maybe even the broader population of Europe, that it was like this setting apart where we're not only going to have freedom from the rule of the crown, but also freedom from the identity. And you could, of course, wage, I mean, and this has happened where there are conflicts among peoples, internecine conflicts, and they don't decide that they are at odds with the identity of the overall people. You know, you could just, I guess, as easily imagine America saying that that they were going to set themselves apart, but they are more loyal to the idea of the identity than the British were. But instead, it seems to be something very different.
Yeah, it's a bizarre series of events that transpired here after the revolution, or well, not in Florida, but elsewhere. And it's a sad thing because what happened is that they could not do away with all of their Anglo-Saxon roots. They had to maintain, the language, although English never became the official language of America. And that was in large part due to the fact that people didn't think it was necessary. And those who did think it was necessary didn't want to be seen as promoting English culture, even though English culture is everywhere in America. So they tried to do away with it. They really couldn't do away with it. What came about was just a more egalitarian, pioneer spirited version of 1770s British culture, particularly English culture. And the fact that they tried so hard to change who they were, concocting some identity which was rooted in abstract ideals, global cosmopolitanism, the fact that they had to work so hard to do this shows just how really English they were. At the end of the day, by the 1800s, there was the War of 1812. That was basically the result of the simmering rage between America and the motherland. But after the War of 1812, America gets into its best period, where it's sort of, since it won the War of 1812, sort of. I mean, the War of 1812 is very difficult to describe because so much of it is sort of like a stalemate. But you could say America won it in a very broad sense because the British were no longer here. I guess you can put it that way. But after that, the anti-British sentiment subsided because at least the Americans convinced themselves that they repelled the British for the second time. They no longer saw the British as a threat to their identity. And there began this era, the best era in American history, between the end of the War of 1812 and the Civil War, that's when you had a real American identity. There was a spirit of national unity between the North and the South, with the exception of the Deep South. But there was a really unique America that was this British society that finally came to terms with itself, and it adjusted itself for egalitarianism, for westward expansion through this pioneer spirit. It became this self-reliant society wherein people were able to have these sort of laboratories of ordered liberty and reasonable, one might say, perspectives on participatory democracy, which is to say that not just every Tom, Dick, and Harry you wanted to vote got the vote. You had to be an individual, some substance to vote. I'm not getting into anything racial. We're talking about among whites. But it was a fascinating period wherein you had harmony. There was, as a matter of fact, the American system of economics, which was designed to create a harmony of interest between people who were lower class, middle class, and upper class. And during this period, you certainly had people earning their fortunes, but America was thought of not necessarily as a place to make a lot of money, but as a place to do your own thing and to live your dream and to be able to at least earn enough to get by without being in penury, as would often be the case in Europe. So it was really a fascinating period. America developed its own literary culture. It developed a fairly substantial scientific base of scientists. I think that'd be the best way of putting it. There were true statesmen here at that time. There was not a sense of hatred between North and South. People were focused on big issues in politics and in society, not, the pettiness, the mindless iconoclasm of the present day. So it was it was the most American period in American history. When people think about the real America, what they're thinking of almost certainly comes out of this period between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. But unfortunately, the Civil War and the years immediately preceding it destroyed this, and then Reconstruction cemented the destruction.
Yeah, I mean, let me just quote you here in the book. You say the early 1800s dawned as a golden age for American national growth and unity, marked by unprecedented prosperity and the forging of a cohesive American identity. And I really like this take and how you've constructed the explanation of a America birthing itself and going to war, maybe inadvertently, not only on the crown, but on its identity. And then that kind of resolving itself a little bit, as you were just articulating, and becoming the America, I think, that we're taught, well, maybe folks of our age, I don't know Zoomers what they're taught anymore, but we were taught that this is like, there's this continuity, and there definitely isn't a continuity, but we're taught that there's this continuity from this America, which seems to be the America that you're talking about at this point in America's history, that this is the golden age. This is when the animosity with Europe and the crown has receded, and we're clearly becoming an identifiable people, an identifiable branch of the sort of the tree of Western kind. And then go ahead.
No, please go ahead. Absolutely, I agree.
Well, I was just going to say, and then like in the midst of that, almost like a rebirth now. It's like you have the birth of the revolution, and which is tumultuous and self-injuring, and then you have this new birth of what now we look back as a very halcyon time, that then because of other issues results in this great fall. And a lot of historians will talk about the Civil War, War for Southern Independence, as the end of America as it had been founded. But I want to hear from you and what you had to share. I mean, you say here the Civil War stands as the supreme tragedy in American history, leaving wounds that have never fully healed. I wonder if you might take it from there and talk to us. How did we
Absolutely.
get into this, and what were
It's
the ramifications?
that's quite an interesting question. The thing of it is this. I think I'll have to quote a paragraph that came soon after the one you read. While the physical toll was heavier on the defeated Confederacy, the spiritual and idealistic losses of the victorious North cut even deeper. With the war's end, a significant part of old America, described in earlier pages, faded into oblivion. What emerged from the ashes was an America wounded not just in body, but in soul, a nation grappling with its spiritual uncertainty and an impoverishment of its ideals, despite the unrivaled material prosperity that ensued. I'll stop reading there. The bottom line is this: the Civil War destroyed America's self-confidence. It destroyed any sense of unity. It destroyed the sort of embryonic, organic culture, a society that was being built across state lines during a period of calm and relative prosperity. And it created this very frenzied, fractious, paranoid, angry so-called society, really parallel societies, wherein people were at that point constantly at odds with each other. And now there was a lead up to this during the last last several years of America's golden era, but the lead up was basically subdued until really the last few years before the Civil War. And you count on one hand, the number of years I'm talking about here. But even then, until the war began, old America was alive, even if it was on life support. But after the Civil War, during and after, I mean, that was just done. And what we got in the wake of the Civil War, instead of an amicable reunion, was Reconstruction. And that was the primary expression of Northern hatred for the South on account of the Civil War, of course. And the sectional hatred that came out of the Civil War led the North to force a government on the South, really a series of governments, state governments that were backed up by the military, and Southerners were disenfranchised. They were not allowed to vote in their own elections. People who came down from the North to run these states, they voted for themselves along with their fellow carpetbaggers. And if somebody was willing to completely repudiate the South in a really outlandish way designed to engender self-hatred, then this person, being called a scallywag, could join with the carpetbaggers in running the new governments. And then, of course, ex-slaves, because slavery ended after the Civil War, did not end with Emancipation Proclamation, as many believe, but it ended after the Civil War. So freed slaves, many of whom could not read or write, were elected to office or appointed to office, and they just served as peons of the whites who were running Reconstruction. Now, most of these whites really did not have any serious political convictions other than getting wealthy. Many people came down from the North because they wanted to make a lot of money off these new Reconstruction governments, because there was basically unchecked corruption, embezzlement, outright theft of public resources. It was crazy. And the money chain was sent all the way up to Congress, and eventually an oligarchy, well, not eventually, very soon, an oligarchy formed in Congress because these people right up to the highest legislature in the land were getting kickbacks. So there was a massive incentive to keep this Reconstruction so-called government going. And it produced such hatred among Southern whites that a lot of them resorted to terrorism against the Reconstruction government. That's when a certain organization with pointy hats came into view, and there was a terrible, terrible series of violent events. And eventually Reconstruction ended in the late 1870s. And it left a South that was tremendously embittered against the North. The North at that point, aside from people who were still making money off Reconstruction, really was over the Civil War. It just wanted to move on. The West was where the game was at, the expanding frontier, all these territories that were about to become states. And the Republican Party no longer needed the South to win. So it really didn't want to keep these Reconstruction occupation governments going. But the people who were profiting off them certainly did. But eventually the president, the newly elected president, Rutherford B. Hayes, managed to end Reconstruction shortly after his inauguration. So a fascinatingly hard period. Something else that happened during Reconstruction. Now, I mentioned that most people really were not there on political conviction to punish the South. Most of them were just there to make money. But there were some people who were really there to punish the South. And these people inherited it, openly they inherited it, the French revolutionary ideals, the French principles, as they were called. And these people wanted to punish Southern whites by ending Southern whites as a people. They wanted to, they did promote heavily miscegenation, and they did so with the intent of creating a biracial group that would be totally loyal to these Reconstruction governments. Obviously, the South was Democratic naturally, but the Reconstruction government, the synthetic government, was Republican. And the idea was that these biracial people who were born out of the heavy promotion of miscegenation would not be at home with the whites or with the blacks, but they would be at home with the government that facilitated their existence. And eventually, the radical Republicans who supported this, and many people called themselves radical Republicans who really weren't, they were just going along, but there was this small vanguard that really believed every word I'm saying. For them, it was a moral principle, nothing that could be chalked up to dollars or cents. Now, these people also wanted to promote this ideology on the North, and the North was definitely opposed to this. And as a matter of fact, these radical Republicans going so far played a big role in their eventual defeat because, like I said, a lot of Northern Republicans, after a while, saw how Reconstruction was becoming this thing that was something even they could not stomach. So they wanted it to end. And indeed, it did end. And in the South, however, the Republicans were viewed as a monolith along with Yankees as being evil. That's just where the expression "damn Yankee" comes from. And they looked at the Republicans who ended Reconstruction as interchangeable with those who started it. They looked at the Republicans in the North who never liked Reconstruction as interchangeable with the true believer radical Republicans who basically created a state that the Southern whites could not vote. They had law enforcement that was politicized and that was basically devoted to their torture, psychologically, in some cases physically. The Southern whites were treated like dirt. They had no say over their day-to-day affairs, and they were looked down upon on the basis of being white Southerners. And Democrats, I mean, the Republicans were not fans of the Democrats at all, but they did allow Democrats up north to vote. So to say that it was just Republicans disliking Democrats is not accurate when it comes to the unique hatred that you saw manifested in Reconstruction public policy. So anyhow, this Reconstruction era created such a groundswell of hatred for the GOP and for all things Yankee that the South became the solid Democratic South. And this continued well into the 20th century. And it also made the South very much insular, concerned with its own affairs, not contributing much to the national landscape. It became sort of an island unto itself that was under federal rule, but not to the extent it was during Reconstruction. And this made the South maligned. It made the South looked at as backward, ignorant, this foreign place. This is where a lot of negative stereotypes of Southerners come from, this post-Reconstruction period. And it also turned whites against blacks, blacks against whites. Again, it turned these people against each other in a way that produced extreme racial hatred and violence. So the Reconstruction legacy is absolutely 110% awful. I say that as a lifelong Republican. And I have a unique perspective on the Civil War because I was born in Florida, in the northern tier of Central Florida. And at that time, it was part of the Deep South, beyond question. But as you can tell, I don't speak with a Southern accent, or at least not in totality. My family is from the North, New York City. I spent a lot of my middle school years in Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, which is 70 minutes from Manhattan. And I was able, as a result of all this, to get a pretty good grasp of the North and the South culturally. And so when it comes to the Civil War, I try to look at it as dispassionately as possible. And I hope that that perspective is reflected in the book. What I see the Civil War as really is yet another, if you will, brother war, where two groups of Anglo-Saxons decided to eliminate each other. And they certainly accomplished that. But there was a problem even beyond this. I mean, that's one hell of a problem. Think about it. But the issue, the issue is this. I have to read from the book. The profound loss transcended mere numbers, profoundly altering the nation's genetic landscape. The sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of young men left behind a generation of bereaved women, either doomed to childlessness or forced to settle for lesser partners, thus perpetuating a cycle of diminished genetic potential for
Hmm.
generations to come. The scars of the Civil War, both seen and unseen, left an indelible mark on the fabric of American society, shaping its destiny for years to come. That's very important because the most vigorous, the most physically able of men on either side tended to volunteer for war, the most patriotic, the most upright,
Yeah.
and they were the ones who were killed first.
Yeah.
And as the war went on, the quality of soldier declined. In the South, there was a saying that both the cradle and the grave was robbed because minors, as well as senior citizens, were forced to go to war by 1865. There's a battle here in Florida, Natural Bridge. It's the reason Tallahassee is the only Southern capital that never fell to the Union. But it was fought by senior citizens and boys who were literally ripped out of school. I mean, literally ripped out of
Yeah.
their classrooms, given a musket and say, you're going to the front line. It goes to show what became of the war. And in the North, what happened is that a lot of the people who were made to serve as the war went on were immigrants fresh off the boat who could not buy their way out of conflict. In the South, the numbers were so small relative to the North that the wealthy wound up fighting alongside anyone else. So in the South, it was actually egalitarian in terms of who saw conflict. But in the North, it was not. In the North, despite claiming the banner of egalitarianism, you could buy your way out of it. And that really spoke to what was coming after the Civil War, this eruption of prosperity wherein the nation's GDP grew astronomically. It was something that would set the stage for the Gilded Age. And it was a period that made America what people now think of as a land to make money. Before that, America was not thought of as a place to make money. It was thought of as a place to live your dream. That was the American dream, literally. What you want to do, just go do it and be satisfied. But from the post Civil War period, the American dream became money, making money, and that was it. So this attracted immigrants, and this is getting into the big wave, which I'm sure you'll ask a question about, so I don't get too much into it. But this is what started the massive wave, the great wave of immigration in the 1880s, this new conceptualization, this new advertising of America, and companies that were desperate to keep up with the nation's growing economy set up shops and factories and factory towns that there weren't enough people here to man. So they marketed America in this way to the immigrants, very poor immigrants from places that generally did not send immigrants to America beforehand. But the American dream did indeed become a nightmare. Now, a lot of people would say that the American dream today is a nightmare because of stuff that happened over the last 20 years. I would argue that the American dream has been undergoing a metamorphosis into a nightmare status for quite a while longer. It's just that a lot of people did not care to see it. And when the American dream became about money, as opposed to money in concert with other things to elevate one's quality of life, that is when the nightmare was inevitable to happen, even though people had a lot of money in the short run, so they really didn't see it immediately. But today we certainly live with the consequences of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, folks, and you want to have this book on your shelf because you're not really going to hear this articulated this way and really anywhere else. I mean, I haven't come across it over the years, but it's so fascinating to me to think about what we know, because what we say is America, what we know to be America, the America that is attacked by all of the new interlopers who come in and don't see themselves reflected in the that founding stock of white men who stood up for their beliefs and a new system of government and made errors, as we were mentioning, in part declaring war not only on the crown for their freedom, but also on themselves, on that identity, and that being a leviathanic error as a result, as it worked through time, but then becoming that America that we know and understand is the American people, is the country nation of America in that period, the early 1800s, as you're mentioning, and then to come to this Civil War period, where now you have, as you're pointing out with these radical Republicans, the call for and the endeavors to achieve this sort of miscegenation nation in America, these like brand new ideas that came out of the most like corrupt places and corrupt interpretations of ideas that came out of other places, then being applied to this very young country that certainly wasn't ready. It hadn't incubated long enough. It wasn't ready to be subjected to these sorts of ideas. And what I find really fascinating is that it really did go from, and you can kind of get more, you get a feel for it, like a visceral feel for it, that the America that presidents will stand up to and their speechwriters will refer to, at least until maybe recently, and maybe a little bit more with Trump, but then that'll probably be it, is this place where there was the can-do spirit, and you had the freedom to go out and to grow your farm, to grow your family, to achieve your success. It was really about that liberty and the consequences of one's work. You couldn't be undone by some of the old structures that we still had in place in Europe. You could go be your own man. And now, like you're pointing out, we have this Civil War, we have this war for Southern independence, and America transformed in many ways. And one of those ways is it becomes a place of economic opportunity. It's not about the individual having the liberty to do nothing and be nothing, or do something and grow his farm, grow his name, his family's surname, grow their economic wealth, but wealth in other ways as well. It really narrowed in on this, you can get rich kind of. And this was a mentality, and this was a consequence. I'll just read quickly from, looks like chapter 7. The migration to America stands as the most remarkable human mass movement in the annals of history. Nothing else comes close in scale or diversity. No other nation has grappled with such an immense and continuous influx of people after Reconstruction. Never before had a human wave surged forth so unexpectedly or inundated a country within such a brief span of time. However, Americans emphatically rejected those who, despite their industriousness or intelligence, harbored disdain for America, failed to integrate into U.S. society, and instinctively sought to transform America. Think about that for a moment, folks. We're talking about right after Reconstruction. Those who sought to transform America into something completely different, into something foreign to its essence. This encapsulates the traditional American stance on immigration. I wonder if you might pick it up there, Joseph, and you had already sort of entered that part of the field, if you will, and explain to us who were the big beneficiaries of this labor that they were suddenly importing into the United States after Reconstruction.
Northern industrialists. I mean, that's squarely it. These people also funded the GOP to go after slavery, because what would have happened eventually is that the North always had more heavy industry than the South. That's just always been the case. But the Northern industrialists saw that eventually slave labor, particularly if it expanded to new territories, soon to be states, it would be used to undercut their businesses radically. There would be factories set up where slaves would do the work as opposed to poor immigrants. And then these companies in the North would go out of business. I mean, they would just be destroyed because, obviously the slave laborers would never be paid, whereas the Northern companies had to pay their labor. So they very much wanted to do away with slavery because of that. These were not people living in, beautiful townhouses along Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia or in Beacon Hill in Boston, even though Boston did have a lot of homegrown abolitionist sentiment. But nonetheless, the big money, these were not people who were motivated by humanitarianism. They they were making a rational decision to try to prevent their businesses from being destroyed. And then, of course, they would have been impoverished. So that was the basis of their support for the Republican Party and opposing slavery. Now, after the Civil War, these same people or their children who were running the factories, the family firms by that point, they said, we have this big economic boom going on now because the South is being reconstructed and the westward settlement is reaching levels we never really thought possible. And we have immigrants coming in, though not the levels they soon would, to the north. And all these people coming back from the war, they want to do something different than when they went off to war. They've changed. Their mindset has changed. Same thing happened after World War II, by the way. The returning GIs were no longer putting up with what they put up with beforehand in every respect conceivable, socially and economically. That produced the baby boom culture and obviously the baby boomer generation because so many of them, this returning soldiers, wanted to have kids and have a higher quality of life. But the same thing was true after the Civil War. So there was a lot of demand for materialism. The spirit of materialism was very high. Also because people no longer had the lofty ideals of America that they once did, so they sought comfort in economic matters. And the industrialists soon discovered that, there aren't enough people here. We need more people. This is ridiculous. So they started marketing this new vision of America where the dream was about earning as much money as possible. It's basically an end in and of itself. They started marketing this idea to people from, different places. But one might say, I go into it in the book. To get into it here would be a bit of a long-winded thing. But the principal places that they marketed America to were Eastern Europe, Western Asia, and Southern Europe. And I could really get into work because it's absolutely fascinating. We'd be here discussing that for about an hour in and of itself. But these places, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and Western Asia, had people who had absolutely nothing in common with the British culture or the culture of the Germans who came, particularly in the late 1700s in Pennsylvania. Some were here even before that. But there was a big German influx in the 1800s, in the 1840s and 50s. But the Germans wound up settling in very well indeed, became indistinguishable from Anglos, actually. And there were some Scandinavians as well. They were basically in the same boat. And basically you had this British populace in America, British descended populace, which was surrounded, if you will, by other Northwestern European groups, including some French, of course. And even though France and England had some terrible, terrible disputes, by the time there was French immigration to America, and it was never all that big, but there was certainly some. They assimilated decently enough to an Anglo-oriented society, unless they were in like an ethnic enclave in Louisiana, which was purchased by the U.S., or near French Canada, northern Maine. But beyond that, the French descended people mixed into America very well. As a matter of fact, the French Protestants mixed in incredibly well, and they have been here since the colonial times. But anyway, talking about the newcomers, they really had a totally different mindset and frame of reference for society than the people who preceded them. And these people came from a peasant-oriented society, generally speaking, to live in America, much as they had back home, and their living conditions shocked the Americans who were here. And there was this ever-growing number of what would be called nowadays white ethnics, that it created a nasty culture clash. The job growth was happening. There was massive economic growth, on top of the growth that was already taking place before the Great Wave began. But the economic growth was not something that necessarily gave people a higher quality of life. It meant there were more hungry mouths to feed and more people scraping by in order to avoid going to bed hungry and eventually dying of starvation. And a lot of people were displaced from jobs, particularly what could be referred to as heritage Americans. And this is where the term hobo comes from, because they would ride railroad cars across the country looking for work or just basically wasting away until they died, especially taking to drink, which was the precursor to fentanyl. So it's really an interesting thing how this immigration negatively impacted the country. This is where you get the idea of a little Italy from or of like a little Greece, a little Syria, this kind of thing. Now, I do have to say the Western Asians were principally Syrians and Armenians, and to a lesser degree Lebanese, and they were a very mercantile people. They did surprisingly well. And a lot of them did not want to live in little Syria. They wanted to blend in with the general population because that's where the money was. They wanted to set up shops and cater to them. They took a very similar approach to the German and Sephardic Jews who preceded them in the United States. There has been a Sephardic Jewish population here since before America was formed, and German Jews came in a big way, along with German Protestants in the 1840s and 50s, and they were indistinguishable from other Germans. Nobody in a community could tell the German Jew from a German Protestant. So all these people got on very well with America. The group that came in, though, in the 1880s were the Eastern European Jews, and they had a very different mindset. They were people who were terribly persecuted by the Tsar. They were made to live in ghettos. They had no concept of national life. They were immensely distrustful of anything resembling a Christian aristocracy. They wanted to basically live among their own and not be persecuted. But at the same time, there was an immense opening among them for left-wing politics. So people think about Jews voting on the left in America. It comes from the Eastern European sector. It does not come from other Jewish groups who preceded them. Although I must say that Eastern European Jews who have come since the Soviet era have been very much on the right, generally speaking, because they're anti-communist. So it's really a fascinating thing. How this all functions. And then, of course, you have the Irish. The Irish started coming in big numbers shortly before the Civil War, but they came in massive numbers after that. And the Irish were unique among Northwestern European immigrants because they held a massive grudge against the Anglo. Because they perceived the American Anglo-Saxon and the Anglo-Saxon of of the motherland as being interchangeable, and so the Irish, generally speaking, wanted to do away with America's WASP so-called aristocracy, as much as you could have an aristocracy in a republic. And by the time the Great Wave of Immigration hit, you saw the beginning of these urban political machines where at that point, they were run principally by Irish, and they worked closely with the new immigrants who are many different backgrounds, but there was an especial propensity among the Eastern European Jews to be very hardcore Democratic activists. And the Democratic Party obviously was running major cities even back then. And so this is where you get the idea of the modern urban political left from. It comes from this period, the Great Wave of Immigration. Now, there were urban political machines before that, Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall, both, New York City. But those machines were not so much oriented towards leftism as they were oriented towards corruption and towards ironclad control over municipal politics, and to the victor went the spoils in any election. And it's not surprising because Tweed, it's an Anglo name, Boss Tweed. But shortly after the Civil War, certainly after the Reconstruction period ended and the Great Wave of Immigration began, and you had the white ethnic takeover of major cities, you had this Irish, very often, but not always, Eastern European Jewish coalition designed to push the Democratic Party ever further leftward on the basis of grievance politics. Although I must stress, and this is what a lot of people get wrong, that it was not that the Eastern European Jews came here with the mindset of disliking Anglos on an ethnic basis. They had no idea who Anglos were. They didn't care. But what they did care about was avoiding a Christian aristocracy, a real one like they had in Russia, which really did persecute them. And they thought that the left would better represent their views in terms of avoiding persecution. But it was the Irish, actually, who had a really bloodline-driven hatred of the Anglo. And it was them, actually, as I discovered, who sort of propelled the Eastern European Jews along in various instances over the years, generations, to be very, very, very pro-immigration, to be very, very, very anti sort of WASP Republican governance, to be reactionarily in favor of measures that would, how do I say this kindly, not contribute to the historic American nation. But people misinterpret this. They think anything Irish was like this. It was not. Some native Irish came here and assimilated very well. They would often convert to Protestantism and change their names, but they did. They did very well for themselves, some of them. Some Eastern European Jews wanted nothing to do with the urban political mess, and they moved to rural areas, and they became indistinguishable, like from German farmers. And then, of course, you have the Scots-Irish, who, as I said before, had basically merged with Anglo-Saxons to form what we would know as Anglo-Saxon society in America. And the German Jews who came, along with the Sephardic Jews, who generally came earlier, were thought of as like anyone else. Literally, the German Jews and the German Protestants, you could not tell the difference between them because the German Jews were Reformed, and the Reformation came out of basically German Protestantism, which influenced this Jewish population. So fascinating stuff here. And it relates to the demographics of the modern left. You see today's left, in which the white ethnic population is being replaced by BIPOCs, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and hardcore anti-white whites. And this is just a continuation of how the Democratic coalition was replaced, how the Anglo element of it was replaced in these big urban centers by white ethnics. And now the white ethnics are being replaced by racial minorities and whites who, some of them could even be Anglo, actually, that really just have a disdain, a hatred of their own race. It's a fascinating thing, to say the absolute least.
It really is fascinating, and exploring the history and the complexity of the history, I guess, is what I'm really focused on at the moment. The complexity of the history and how these vested, self-interested industrialists, for example, after during Reconstruction, after Reconstruction, redefined America, and in their endeavor to have labor, marketed America as a place to make money to other parts of the globe. I think you also mentioned Chinese as well early on. Come to America, get rich, get everything you've ever wanted. Come to America, come work for us. And radically changing, as a consequence, the course that otherwise we were on as a country, to become something unified with a singular identity, a singular people, with some other minority groups present, but otherwise, by far and away, predominantly a single people and a single identity. And that this inflection, this juncture, changed everything. And it was all at the service of really a lot of cupidinous, wealthy people who were looking for more money by way of more consumers. And there was some ideological factors certainly there as well. I think what we'll do, this is a really fascinating spot that maybe we'll do the old cut and thrust. We'll have you come back, and not this coming Wednesday, but the next Wednesday. We'll have you come back the Wednesday after, and we'll finish up covering your amazing book here. Folks, I really want you to reach out and get yourself a copy, get it on your bookshelf. It's a fascinating read. I've already dug deeply into it. And as I said, there is a poetry mixed into the prose. And I gave some examples here today, reading some quotes right out of the book. But brother, if you could tell folks what you're doing and where they can find you, where they can find more of you, and then we'll have you back to finish up the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. I'll be glad to return. People can find me on Twitter, or X as it's now called. Just type in Joseph Ford Cotto and I should come right up. I do have the blue check, so there's no question it's me. They can also subscribe to my X page if they want exclusive commentary and analysis. And I would encourage them to perhaps, if they choose to follow my page, different than subscribing to it, I would encourage them to check out some of the videos that I post, the episodes of the show. There's stuff there that offers insight on the news, which, put mildly, you're not going to see on Fox News, or certainly not PBS, NBC, whatever. So please do check all this stuff out and share it if you find the content to be of interest. My goal is to change the news media landscape, and in my own relatively small way, I'm making headway in doing that. And Jason, of course, is trying to change the moral landscape of the country. And in his own way, he's definitely making progress in doing that. But as with anything else, the progress relies upon people supporting it and spreading the word about it. So thank you very much for your time, Jason, and everyone. If you would check out my Twitter page, I think you'll find stuff there that would be really, really of use to you.
Please do follow Joseph, folks. The links are below for his X account and for the book you can see on your screen right now. What Happened to America? You can see he's getting into it in a way. We're just covering just the surface here. He gets into it in a way that's probably different than you've ever heard before. You get some more of the complexity, and as you do, you get to you'll feel like you're getting a clearer a telling of society, the dynamism of the human animal, the human being, and how outcomes that we see in our world today actually come about instead of the very superficial, vapid takes of anthropomorphizing entire groups of people and in entire periods in history. There's much more rich and colorful complexity to it. And when we have Joseph back, we'll cover from where we've left off moving forward, and it will begin to look a lot more familiar to you as we march through the decades in these once great United States. Hopefully we'll get there again with the help of people like the great Joseph Cotto here. But folks, I will be back in about 60 seconds. Thanks for being on, brother.
Pleasure to be here, Jason. Looking forward to being back, and of course, looking forward to featuring your perspective on my program.
We'll do it. Absolutely. We'll see you soon. You are so very lucky because we're rolling in again. And if you haven't already, please share and like the stream. As you know, we are censored by the anti-whites. But the thing that you can count yourself the luckiest about is that we have the admired Dr. Joseph Fort Cotto here to speak with us. Part 2 about his book. Let me bring him forward and we'll get underway. Brother, great to see you. How are you doing?
Very glad to be on, Jason. Thank you for inviting me back.
Well, we had such a great discussion. We were diving in deep Wednesday before last, and you're very exciting. Your brand new book. You say it's your most controversial. And of course, it is the What Happened to America. And very exciting part 1. And we've already had some people from the community purchase your book. They've actually received it already, and they're digging in and saying great things about it. And we want to continue to push and spread that information to as many people as we possibly can. But to bring people up to speed, and I think myself as well, we left off around around after Reconstruction, and we were talking about the industrialists, primarily in the northern part of the country, who decided that they wanted more labor and they had new messaging for this new labor, a lot of it coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, saying that come to America. It's not a place. It's not an ideology. It's not a people. It's not a way of life. It's not something to come and love. It is a place where you can get rich and you can have all the cars or whatever, I guess, buggies, and you can have all the lamps and fortune and ladies that you want. And the population came in, and you were talking about, as I recall, the white ethnics coming in, taking over the cities, and that's roughly where we left off. I think the next chapter was, let me look at what I have here. I think it was chapter 8, and this is where a lot of people who are in what we refer to as the white sympathetic sphere, both implicit and explicit, this is where their knowledge sort of as unfinished sort of as it is, as superficial as it is about America and what went wrong. We can see, though, from your book, there was a lot going wrong before we got to the 1965 Immigration Act, dividing I think you say here, the story of the pre-65 migration to America divided into 2 distinct old and new migrations. And Chapter 9, Gazing at Europe's Tapestry, reveals the stark contrast between its northern expanse and the realms of the East and South. This illuminates the profound divergence between the old and new Immigration Waves. I wonder if we might pick it up right there. And if you have the book already, ladies and gentlemen, that is roughly pages 95, 105, and then going into chapter 10 as well. But the mic is yours, brother.
Oh, thank you, Jason. It's really important to look at where the immigrants came from to the U.S. There was the massive, it's called the Great Wave, which began in the 1880s, and it really didn't end until the 1920s. And that's when most of what would be referred to as white ethnics came to America. Now, obviously, before that, in older immigration waves, there were non-Anglos who came in large numbers, but not nearly to the extent that one found from the 1880s onward. At that point, it was it was an onslaught that really changed the country's culture. And America did have a serious, distinct culture of its own that had some, I would not say uneasy origins, because it sort of came out of an Anglo pioneer spirit, merged with other groups who were in the area that the Anglos were settling, and these people sort of merged after a point into a not exclusively Anglo, but certainly Anglo characterized culture. And this is in colonial America. And that set the standard for what would become known as American culture, which really took, I would say, it grew into something profoundly appreciable after the end of the War of 1812 up until the Civil War, although during the last few years before the Civil War, things were absolutely falling off the rails. And then the Civil War was basically like the Revolutionary War, an Anglo-Saxon civil war that saw the country's foundational stock eradicate each other. And this is where we get into the Great Wave, the 1880s, because after the Civil War came Reconstruction, which further set Anglo against Anglo. And in the wake of Reconstruction, there was this massive desire for cheap labor. And the immigrants were the ones who obviously were going to satisfy that desire. And the desire was had principally by industrialists who themselves were of Anglo background, and some farmers as well. Most of the farmers were Anglo too. And so it's really interesting how this all happened basically as a conflict between Anglos. And of course, there were, Dutch, French Huguenots, Swedes, but they definitely, melted is not the right word, but they became part of the Anglo society to the extent that they were indistinguishable. Same thing for German Protestants, with the exception of some parts of Pennsylvania where they had their own distinct culture, and they do to this day. But by and large, all these groups became part of the Anglo-centric society. And that society's bedrock, of course, were the English and the Scottish. And the English and the Scottish, despite being two very different groups, as well as the Welsh, another separate group, these are the peoples of Great Britain. And so in America, over time, they all became referred to as Anglo-Saxon, even though historically that's not correct. But as an American colloquialism, basically it came to be a definable group. So whatever. Anyhow, talking about the 1880s, there was this massive, not just one wave, a series of waves that could be referred to collectively as the Great Wave. And it brought people here from areas that traditionally had not sent a great deal of immigrants to America. And in order to understand this, you have to understand the anthropology of Europe. And I did get into the three basic categorizations of European peoples. And I'll read a bit from the book here and there, just jumping around, because obviously I can't go through the whole thing. It'd take too long. I wrote, first, we encounter the sturdy Nordics, hailing from the northern realms of Europe, encompassing Scandinavia, the British Isles, and northern Germany. Here, amidst rugged landscapes and icy fjords, these peoples thrived, forging a culture marked by resilience and fortitude. Venturing southward, we encounter the Alpines, whose roots delve into the heart of Central Europe, nestled among the majestic peaks of the Alps mountains. This group includes the spirited French, the meticulous Swiss, the industrious Northern Italians, and the stalwart Southern Germans. Their heritage reflects a fusion of mountainous terrain and vibrant cultural exchanges, shaping communities known for their ingenuity and resourcefulness. Lastly, we traverse the sun-kissed lands of Southern Europe, where the vibrant Mediterraneans dwell. From the shores of Portugal to the rugged cliffs of Greece, and from the picturesque landscapes of Sicily to the verdant hills of Albania, this group embodies the warmth and passion of Mediterranean life. Their heritage is steeped in centuries of maritime trade, ancient civilizations, and a rich tapestry of culinary delights, creating a mosaic of diversity and vitality. Now, of course, Northern Europe is the group that historically characterized the United States, particularly Northern Europeans from the British Isles. On the whole, Northern Europe stands as a bastion of simplicity and stability. And then going into Eastern Europe, things definitely change. And it's worth noting because Eastern Europeans started coming to the U.S. in large numbers during the 1880s. They are the foremost group of immigrants. If you could refer to Eastern Europeans as a group, which a lot of people would not do because there's so much diversity among them. But Eastern Europeans did not come to the U.S. to any large degree until the 1880s. Now, contrasting Northern Europe with the mosaic of Eastern Europe, where complexity and instability reign supreme. Situated on the doorstep of Asia, Eastern Europe has borne the brunt of successive Asiatic invasions, resulting in a tumultuous history of political upheaval and racial blending. The Slavic peoples, technically being Alpine, bear the indelible marks of Mongol and Turkic heritage, reflecting a fairly recent and unstable amalgamation. And also, class divisions are a big deal in Eastern Europe, as is the case throughout most of Europe. But in Eastern Europe, the rigid class system, really feudalism, lasted until the 1800s. So its ending being much more recent means that the effects of class conflict are much more acutely felt in Eastern Europe. And that's a big reason why communism took root there. And then in Southern Europe, there is a middle ground between the contrasting landscapes of the North and the East. Italy, Spain, and Portugal, the tourist-friendly nations of the South, boast ancient and intertwined cultures, standing shoulder to shoulder with their northern counterparts in stability and tradition. Yet despite this cultural resilience, Southern Europe's political terrain is less steady, while its ethnic makeup is a tapestry of complexity. And it's interesting because people who are of Mediterranean background can be found throughout Western Europe. They're not just in Southern Europe. And that's due basically to the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire went as far north as Britain. That's where Britannia comes from, the word. And you will see people in England who are of completely English background, and yet they look Mediterranean because their ancestors, particularly in the south of England, were Romans. And so they do appear Mediterranean, but their culture obviously is not Mediterranean. The Mediterranean cultural aspects of Roman rule long since, you could say, went away in England. But if you look at Mediterraneans who remained in their ancestral homeland, you see quite a few different things. I'll read a bit here. While British Mediterraneans, descending from imperial Roman settlers, remained isolated, mixing primarily with Nordics, Southern Europe has been a melting pot, shaped by Alpines and Nordics from the north and infused with influences from West Asia, North Africa, and even in a remote sense, sub-Saharan Africa. Within Italy, a stark division emerges between North and South, each representing distinct ethnic compositions. The North boasts chiefly Alpine heritage tinged with Mediterranean and Nordic descent. Meanwhile, the South presents a mosaic of Mediterranean heritage intertwined with Asiatic and North African influences, alongside subtle traces of sub-Saharan African ancestry. Spain's ethnic makeup mirrors Italy, while Portugal's lower classes are characterized by a significantly darker complexion. I'll stop there. But this is the very rough, very brief anthropology of Europe, and it's absolutely worth getting into. Believe it or not, I guess this is not hard to believe at all. In years gone by, people wrote much more about the peoplehoods of Europe. There are many different peoples, of course. And in looking at the peoplehoods of Europe, the native European peoples, one can learn a great deal about what's going on today. But it has been sort of shunned, an honest anthropology of Europe, since about the 1940s, I would say. World War II played a role in that, but that was not the only thing. And if you look at people who wrote about European anthropology in a real sense, beginning into the 1890s. And in the 1920s, quite a bit more was written about it. You really do begin to see how and why things developed in the way that they did. Issues that pertain to us today and which will go on for future generations. And unfortunately, the anthropology of Europe is not nearly discussed as much as it should be. If it were, people would find what's going on today to be far less shocking.
You said something that really struck me, and I just want to, talking about this great wave, and you talked about it, you mentioned it was an onslaught that changed the culture. And I think that's really pertinent to trying to understand the United States, the influence of, what we would refer to, and I rightly call the anti-white, individualistic industrialists who had money as their god, if you will, and were interested in increasing their wealth and power at the expense of the population, which of course is almost 100% white. And yes, many of the peoples that they're bringing in are also white, or most of the people they're bringing in are also white. But these are people that are answering the appeal for greater wealth, for self-improvement, for more selfish individualism. And that, of course, had this deleterious impact. And we're talking about, you mentioned also Anglo conflicts. And many of these conflicts were brought from their places of origin, weren't they? The different ethnicities and different between Catholic and Protestant. I wonder if you might just elaborate a little bit more on that and how that in and of itself was problematic. We didn't have an idea of America that was, I guess, singular, and what it was, perhaps what our founders really wanted it to be. It was already being muddied, and we were the pool of immigrants were already being selected for in terms of those who were most interested in making a dollar and getting ahead. And I wonder if you might develop that a little bit more, because I know we have here. We have the 1914, the world plunged into a fiery abyss of war. I really love your writing. And folks, you're going to really enjoy this book, because not only does Joseph provide a lot of stimulating and educational material, but he writes in a way that is that's really fluid. The constructions are more than intelligible, and that's saying a lot for the writing of most authors today. They're actually very pleasant to read. But I wonder if you might develop that a little bit more so we can really appreciate how early America was suffering this identity crisis.
Well, America was never one place. You have to remember, it was different colonies along the eastern seaboard. There were 15 colonies. Well, I guess 14 east and west Florida. Only East Florida was on the eastern seaboard. West Florida, though, bordered eastern Florida at the Apalachicola River, which is west of Tallahassee. But we'll just say 15 for the sake of conversation. There were 15 British colonies, and these were each settled at a different time by different people for different reasons. So up in New England, you had a very strongly pietistic puritanical mindset, which more or less called for a very early primitive form of the left-wing administrative state. Collectivism was big. Group enforced morality was big. And it was the idea that people would more or less never be good enough in terms of being themselves. They always had to be artificially pushed to be something else, something greater, to have as utopian a society as possible. And it's no surprise that by the time you fast forward to the Civil War, the hotbed of left-wing thinking in the country was in New England. And it's also interesting because people talk about America needing to be more religious. But back in the age of the Civil War, the most religious part of America was in the Northeast, and the South certainly was Christian overwhelmingly. but it was a much more laid back form of Christianity. Southerners tended to be more tolerant people than Northerners in the day. And it was in the North where you had this militant mindset of forcing other people to be as you want them to be. And that played a massive role in the abolitionist movement. So you had different groups of Britons settling different places up and down the eastern seaboard. That is what laid a lot of the groundwork for division. Also, of course, slavery. Slavery was something that gave people a reason to go up against each other. It was an issue that people used as a bulwark against each other. And the Civil War was the culmination of these things, as well as the French revolutionary principles. That's a massive, massive thing that I cover in the book. Getting into the religious aspects would have taken too much time, but the French revolutionary principles were something of great consequence to America. They took root here because America was looking after it won its independence to define itself in opposition to Britain, because you had so many people here with British background, and yet they were not technically part of Britain anymore. So really, who were they? Well, a lot of them decided we're going to be French revolutionary thinkers, but we're not going to take it as far as the violent fanatics of that revolution. And this played into that pietistic puritanical mindset in New England, but it also characterized a lot of people outside New England, particularly in Pennsylvania and in New York. And it definitely brought up slavery as an issue to use against the slave states. And the slave states were content at that time to keep slavery unto themselves. But then after the cotton gins invention, slavery became much more profitable. But of course, the transatlantic slave trade was banned. And we should all be very glad it was banned, because if it were not banned today, I mean, America would be like Haiti. The whole institution of chattel slavery here was a horrendous idea beyond what words could possibly describe. I cannot deplore it enough, and not on PC grounds, but simply because slavery produced a state of affairs for America that's absolutely detrimental, but very instructive, because slavery is all about the search for as cheap labor as possible. And then when you fast forward to the 1880s, when the Anglo-Saxons had destroyed themselves in the Revolutionary War and then the Civil War, and then bad blood set in during Reconstruction, you had a certain subset of these Anglos who want to bring people here for what else? Cheap labor. And that's how you get these Southern and Eastern Europeans, principally, as well as some Western Asians that came, and they absolutely changed America from what it once was. And talking about what it once was, the last time America had a really stable cultural identity was between the War of 1812's aftermath and the run-up to the Civil War. That was the real Americana, the real American culture. Of course, it existed before that, and it existed after that, exists to this day, but in pockets, really. But America was as close to a unified cultural entity as can be imagined between the 1812 war's conclusion and the beginning of the Civil War. And the only exception to that was in the Deep South, where there was a sort of Caribbean mindset about slavery. Slavery in the South was viewed in the Deep South was viewed much more favorably than it was even in Virginia, Tennessee. And people in the Deep South were livid that the transatlantic slave trade was banned. And that set them on a course against the federal government. Obviously, the Civil War, including many other things, grew out of this. And it was really something else. But of course, the abolitionists were glad to use the hardcore pro-slavery views of the Deep Southerners against them. There were ferocious, indiscriminate denunciations of white Southerners by abolitionists. And a lot of the abolitionists actually wanted to produce a biracial population in the South, which would be totally loyal to the Reconstruction government, which facilitated its existence. All this stuff is a big consequence if you're talking about why America is so disunited and why its Anglo-Saxon foundational stock turned upon itself time after time. And by the time you get to the 1880s with the Great Wave, you have this Anglo population that's very much wiped out in terms of its ideals. It's wealthier than it's ever been, but it's more set against itself than it's ever been. And there have always been problems. And so this set the stage for a very new vision of America, rooted in the pursuit of wealth as the American dream. My last thing is that the American dream has always been around, but it was thought of as basically the ability to come to America and build the sort of life you wanted for yourself. Of course, that meant getting wealthy. That was great. It could have just meant having a small farm that you wanted, that you never could have got in the society you came from, because there was feudalism. But the fact of the matter is, the American dream that from the 1880s onward, from the post-Reconstruction era onward, became this thing of getting as much money as possible for its own sake, having as many toys as possible. He who has the highest stack of gold rules. That is a uniquely post-Reconstruction mindset. That's because the high ideals of this idea of a Renaissance sort of period in America died with the Civil War. There was an attempt to bring back an American Renaissance around the turn of the century, but it didn't go anywhere. I mean, it was too much. It was over. It was well since over, generations over. But the changing of what constitutes the American dream also is pivotal in understanding why America became such a fractious place. Because when people came here to do their own thing in the context of an Anglo society, it meant that basically individual liberty was the paramount. But when people came here to make as much money as possible, accruing capital obviously was paramount at whatever cost. And that's where you get these urban slums, these organized crime rings, these immigrant groups that refuse to assimilate. And why would they assimilate when they can just have a more prosperous version of their society in the U.S.? Although I do stress that a more prosperous version of their society meant a third world society that was a bit wealthier than what it was in the old country. But by the standards of America, even in the late 1800s, that was still a highly disadvantageous, undesirable thing, because the standard of living in America was so much higher than what these new immigrants were willing to put up with in any case.
It's so fascinating to learn about from you America in a completely different way. This is, I think, in so many of these pieces, I think all of us, we've learned a little bit about this or a little bit about that, that you've addressed, but putting it all together and seeing how these different white populations, primarily it's obviously white populations coming to the United States, that we started off with this very healthy Anglo stock that went to war against itself, not only in terms of the crown, but also in terms of the identity, moving on to the struggle with that identity, as we have industrialists who are very selfish, and they were more of the mind of just making themselves wealthy, bringing in a population of people who were interested in the same thing, and thereby selecting those from Europe who wanted to be, for lack maybe of a better word, just selfishly individualistic. Now, you did mention that in the midst of selecting for this selfish individualism, which I think is such a challenge today, this arc has been extremely destructive. And we see when it comes to white people that they never think of the individual well-being by way of our people's well-being. I make the comment from now and again, the little quip, if you will, that if a powerful people come to America and you go to the white population and you tell them this people is powerful, they're going to come in and they're going to do what they want. The white population doesn't think we're in trouble. They don't have a we. They get out their resume. And they apply for positions with the powerful people coming in. And this is, of course, disastrous. You can't be selfish individualists in a world of collectives. But America did make a little bit of an effort. And you write that legislation was passed after 1880, aimed mainly to bar unsuitable individuals, such as criminals and mentally ill. But those were, and I wonder if you might speak to that a little bit as well, because it seems like the Americans of that time were looking at a very specific set of visible, objectionable traits: mentally ill, refusing to work, malingerers, and this sort of thing, while ignoring something that was more fundamental, and that is Are you here to become part of the American people? Are you here to become part of the American identity? And with that absent, we end up with people showing up wanting the highest pay. But yeah, just before we get into, and I think I'll just tap into this right now. And this is from chapter 15, folks. As the immigrant stream underwent a metamorphosis, the positive impact of immigration restriction on America's economic and social landscape became increasingly apparent, drawing superior caliber of immigrants from corners of the globe. Previously, the flood of mass immigration pre-World War I had not only deterred uh, self-respecting, ambitious individuals from seeking opportunities in America, but had also deteriorated the quality of incoming immigrants. Yet, as the tide shifted with working conditions and living standards on a healthy trajectory, America once again attracted the cream of the crop. So, one of you might maybe speak to the prohibitions on things that were salient, like mental illness, and then how America began bringing in some better stock, if you will.
Well, America really did not get its act together until literally the Johnson Act of 1924. And that was a hell of a long time from the beginning of the 1880s until then. It's about 40 years. So loads and loads of people came in. And there was no, even though Uncle Sam tried, there was no real way to determine their criminal record because how are they going to get records from places where most people were illiterate? I mean, it's just not, wasn't going to happen. So there was basically a situation where anybody could come here that could get over here was allowed to stay here unless they were found to have typhus or something when they arrived. But even some of them wound up getting through. So that's how the immigrant slums got such terrible diseases. They became disease-ridden. So the measures designed to stop even people who were physically ill from coming here were anything other than foolproof. And there were four primary groups of the new immigration. One was the Eastern European peasants, two, the Eastern European Jews, three, the Southern Europeans. They were mostly peasants, and of course, four Western Asiatics. Most of them came from Syria and Armenia. Some also came from Lebanon. Fascinating history with them. And generally speaking, all these groups did want to make money. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to make money. Let's be clear about that. But that was their idea of America, a place to make money and not much else. And these were people who really didn't view nationhood in the way that Americans did on the whole. I mean, they certainly had a concept of a nation state, but the peasants, a lot of these people were just used to being bossed around, and to them, their nation was basically their feudal masters telling them X, Y, and Z. Then, of course, there were the Eastern European Jews who were very severely persecuted by the Tsar, and to them, nationhood was something threatening because obviously the Tsar was lording over them under the authority of Imperial Russia. So they looked at nationhood in that context of a Christian aristocracy as being a terrible thing. And you really can't blame them when you consider what was done to them by the Tsar. And the Tsar, by the way, persecuted many Eastern European Gentile groups, just in a different way than the Jews. It was not religious persecution, but it was definitely the idea of basically keeping them slaves. Or close to enslaved. Cheap labor, the search for that always produces interesting, to say the least, results. Then there were the Western Asiatics, and although they were the most ethnically foreign of all groups to come during the Great Wave, they did the best. There were in some cases like a little Syria or a little Armenia, but these places tended not to last. The Western Asiatics did want to merge with the society because they were a mercantile group, and they very much believed in coming here and setting up their own shops and being sort of a seamless part of the overall environment. As a matter of fact, quite a few of these people, they're overwhelmingly Christian, very few Muslims. Quite a few of them wound up converting to Protestantism. So that it goes to show how well they took to assimilation. The most ethnically foreign groups of all wound up being the best at assimilation. That is one of history's ironies for certain. So when you had all this going on, but it's worth noting that the Western Asiatics were the smallest of the new immigrant groups. So you had all this going on. And the end result was that America became something profoundly different. And the immigration that took place had an extremely negative effect upon the people already here. It
Mm.
was something. It was something you could say soul shattering, but America's soul had already been shattered by the Civil War and Reconstruction. This was sort of like, I would say, lighting the pieces on the ground on fire. And America became this place wherein it was basically a clearinghouse, the polyglot boarding house, as Teddy Roosevelt famously said. And that was really not much of a country at all. And America goes through something rather similar today, although obviously in a different context. So it's really it's fascinating how this situation came to be. It is, I guess, disheartening to see how much division there has been in the U.S. historically when it comes to these immigrant groups, and of course the foundational stock. But this disunity is there. And if you look at the 1924 Act, it was absolutely required because, I mean, if this had gone on, today America would probably have close to 1 billion people, and it would be a third world country beyond doubt. I mean, people will be competing viciously, in some cases in a deadly manner, for scarce resources. This is what happens in any society that gets overpopulated. So it's something else, really. This history, it is something else. The 1924 Act preserved America as a first world society, and it definitely made the country more attuned to, I would say, cohesion to the fullest extent possible. Obviously, there's not going to be cohesion after all the division that had taken place. But from the 20s onward, there was as close to cohesion as could be found. And that was pivotal because the Great Depression was coming, the Second World War was coming, and if the country were as fractured as it was, say, in the 1910s, in the Great Depression, this place would become a war zone. It would have been people with no trust whatsoever in their community, basically doing unmentionable things to their neighbors because money was scarce. And then there would have been in World War II. I mean, could you imagine trying to draft peoples? I stress the word peoples, who have not much in the way of loyalty to anything other than making money at any given point in time. There would have been riots, as there was, by the way, in the immigrant heavy, this is the old immigration, in the immigrant heavy New York City during the Civil War. People, principally Irish, had moved there and they felt no loyalty to the U.S. whatsoever. And they were focused, they were sort of the forerunner to the new immigration, but they were not the new immigration. I'll be very clear about that. But they were there, the Irish in New York City during the Civil War period. They had come to make money, but there weren't nearly as many of them as would be the case with the new immigrants, and they were not nearly as spread out. And when the Union tried to draft these people to fight the Confederates, there were riots, big riots in New York City, because the idea was that I'm here as someone who's from somewhere else and I just want to make money. Why am I going to fight your damn war? And that would have happened during World War II across the whole country if things were as they were about 30 years earlier with this never-ending wave of immigration. So the 1924 Johnson Act definitely preserved America as a first world country, and it prevented a slew of terrible, terrible things from happening. And I will reiterate about the Great Depression. It would have been like Mad Max. If you have already low trust communities being thrown into poverty, there would have been basically roaming gangs ruling over certain areas, like not just certain neighborhoods, but like certain counties. And the reason this did not happen during the Great Depression is because there was something in the way of cohesion by and large, and the social controls from that cohesion made it so people pulled together during hard times rather than tear each other apart.
Absolutely fascinating. And I think we have really filled out the understanding as much as we can do here of the background for maybe discussing current America, which I think we could probably include Kennedy in current America. In chapter 16, we have John F. Kennedy, often celebrated for his charm and charisma, and no less frequently heroic to his fellow Democrats and Roman Catholics, emerges as a pivotal figure in the intricate saga of immigration reform. Yet beneath the veneer of his public persona lies a legacy rife with ethnic grievance and a blatant disregard for the long-term apolitical ramifications of his actions. Kennedy's aversion to immigration restriction bills fueled his personal background as an Irish Catholic at odds with America's entrenched Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment, laid the groundwork for his progressive approach to immigration policy. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be interested in hearing you expand on that, but I do want to let you know that we already have one member of the community, AOC, saying Dr. Cotto is brilliant. Why can't a guy like him be president? So with that compliment, if you could develop that chapter for us, if you would. This is very interesting because I think every American today feels like Kennedy and pretty much his whole presidency, assassination, is a big inflection point for the United States. And so we're eager to hear.
Yes, what happened with JFK was monumental. And I do thank the commenter who said such kind words about me. They're greatly appreciated. As far as JFK goes, he came from a very politically active family in Boston of Irish Catholic background, which is to say, really native Irish background. And they had no love at all for the English. As a matter of fact, Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father, was appointed the ambassador to the United Kingdom by FDR, and he had to be recalled during World War II because Joseph Kennedy was making pro-Nazi statements. So that's how anti-English the Kennedys were. Now, the Kennedys looked at immigration as a source of their political power because the immigrants tended to vote Democratic, particularly in large urban centers. That was nothing new. That had been going on since the mid-1800s. But the Kennedys really exemplify something unique, wherein you have this white ethnic control over urban political machines of, aligned with the Democratic Party, wherein the Irish Catholics tended to play the principal role, but then Eastern European Jews were brought on as helpers, one might say. And this was a profoundly resilient coalition, which still exists to this day. As a matter of fact, you see it with the Biden administration. Joe Biden, of Irish Catholic background, both of his children are married to Eastern European Jews, the surviving children at least. And that's not at all surprising to me because this is something that's been going on for generations, not necessarily within the Biden family. But you see people who come out of these big city Democratic machines, and it tends to be the Irish Catholics who ran them, and then the Eastern European Jews who operated with them. And these people eventually developed such a strong affinity for each other that there was, and continues to be, very high rates of intermarriage among them. Why did this affinity happen? It's key to understanding what took place with JFK. It's because the Irish Catholics had this extreme anti-Anglo animus, and the Eastern European Jews did not have any sort of inherent disdain for Anglos, but they did have an inherent disdain for anything that resembled what the Tsar did to them, a Christian aristocracy that was persecuting people. So when they came to America and they saw the WASP establishment, it reminded them of the Tsar, even though the WASPs were not persecuting these Eastern European Jews. But the Irish were very anti-Anglo, and so they offered jobs in the political machine and in jobs that the political machine impacted, public sector and private sector jobs. They offered these Eastern European Jewish immigrants, most of whom didn't speak a word of English, jobs on the basis of a political alliance to keep these urban political machines as democratic and obviously exclusionary towards Anglo-Saxon interests. And the Anglo-Saxons were thought of to a man as Republicans, which was not correct technically, but it was the impression which these inner city Anglos had. And they believed that the Republicans, if they got in power, these Anglo-Saxons would discriminate against the white ethnic immigrants and their children and their children's children. So this is a fascinating political coalition in the urban centers of the Irish Catholics and the Eastern European Jews, rooted in, for different reasons, animus towards Anglo-Saxon Republican rule. I do wish to stress, though, that this was not a conspiracy in a black helicopter, done by people wearing a tinfoil hat, going around saying blah, blah, blah. This is just real history. It happened. It was about political control, and it was about the Republican Party being perceived not simply as the party of the rich, but as the party of the Anglo. And that's because the GOP at the time was overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon. Today, it disproportionately still is. So anyway, that's what happened here. And this is what infused JFK's mind as he was growing up, and obviously made it so his public policy be oriented in a certain direction. Now, he was very strongly in favor of ending the 1924 Act well before the 60s. He was in favor of ending it during the 1950s. This thought was this great time of conservatism and stability in America. In reality, the 50s were not this. The time of stability was about 100 years earlier, before the Civil War. But the 50s, a lot of stuff was coming up out of the woodwork at that time. Was, boiling, simmering tensions. And that's why the 60s exploded in the social change revolution. But in the 50s, JFK wanted to do away with the 24 Act and create a system basically of family reunification, whereas if one immigrant came here, then he could sponsor his family, and these people could come from anywhere across the world. And he wrote a book called The Nation of Immigrants to promote his ideas. And he died. He was assassinated. By whom? Who knows? I mean, at this point, really, who cares? But the fact is that he definitely did lose his mind in Dallas. And as a result, there was a massive wave of sympathy for him and the Democratic Party. And as part of this sympathy wave, it was said, this immigration bill that we've wanted for some time, let's get it through. And this was at the time that the Civil Rights Act was coming about. It had not been passed yet, but it was certainly coming into view, as well as the Fair Housing Act and the Voting Rights Act, some of the most consequential pieces of legislation in altering the very fabric of America. And JFK's Immigration Act, the one that he never got to do in his lifetime, was passed as a memorial to him in 1965. He died in late 63. It was passed, it was signed into law on July 4th of 1965. And I guess you could say this was a new Independence Day, because it definitely would establish an America independent from the past. It is worth noting that the Democrats were broadly and overwhelmingly in favor of this immigration bill, except for the ones from the South. A lot of the ones in the South did not favor this immigration bill, nor did a lot of Republicans. But they were massively outnumbered in Congress after the 1964 election. So, the immigration bill was from 65. It was a direct consequence of Barry Goldwater losing and the Republicans getting swamped, absolutely swamped in Congress, and the Democrats having this insane, unbelievable majority that was like something out of the early New Deal period. It did not last. It did not last because there was massive backlash to the Immigration Act, which was profoundly unpopular. It was opposed by a 2-to-1 margin, but the Democrats jammed it through anyway because they understood that they could import a new electorate. And at that time, what was happening is in the 1964 election, you saw the beginning of what we see today, where the GOP becomes the de facto white party. In up until the early 60s, both the Democratic and Republican parties were the white parties, just that the GOP was the Anglo-white party. That was the perception, at least, whereas the Democrats were the white ethnic party. Once again, that was the perception. There were Anglo-Democrats and white ethnic Republicans for sure, long before the 60s. But the perception was, for many people, reality. So the Democrats saw their opportunity to pass this Immigration Act that would deal with something which unnerved them, because in 64, even though the Republicans got their backsides beaten, for the first time, there was the consolidation of the white vote within their ranks, particularly within the South. And it was seen what could happen, wherein if Democrats, and these Southerners were loyal Democrats until then, until Goldwater, if these Democrats were to leave their party for the GOP and become Republicans, then the Democrats would be out of power because the country was overwhelmingly white. So the Democrats looked at their fellow whites leaving for the GOP and they said, something has to be done about this. We're going to be screwed. Even though they just had this massive victory, but they were thinking of the long run. And the 1965 Act was definitely intended by them to be a remedy to the emerging white coalition within the GOP. And it's performed profoundly well for the Democrats, because the reason why they're a competitive party today is squarely because of the 1965 Act. If America still had its demographics from before 65, the Democrats would be a permanent minority party today. Actually, AOC, people like her probably would never even been elected to Congress, because New York City would still be a white ethnic citadel, and others look looking like, well, not looking like, I should say. I was trying to figure out who to bring up here because there are so many. Fannie Willis in Georgia. She is of Black American heritage, not immigrant heritage, but Atlanta has been inundated by immigration over the last few decades, as well as blacks who moved there from other parts of the country, but a large part of it's immigration. So if there were no 1965 Act, someone like Fannie Willis never would become the DA of Fulton County. The 1965 Act has ramifications that are astounding, absolutely astounding. And the demographics have shifted in a very leftward direction as a result of that act. So the Democrats understood they were passing something unpopular, but they understood they could do it under the guise of venerating JFK. And it was actually said just to be an ornamental bill, a symbolic bill for him, which was not true. But it was passed as a memorial to him in concert with other civil rights legislation. And it was done by a party that would soon be at a big loss in 68 with Nixon and the silent majority. But by then, the change was baked into the cake. And the Democrats understood that, yeah, they might be screwed for a little while. The GOP won the presidency twice with Nixon. Then there was Ford, who served out the term, one term with Carter, the Democrat, then the Reagan, the Republican. So the Democrats actually did pay for what they did in terms of presidential politics, but they were looking at the long run beyond the next few presidential election cycles. They were looking at generational power. And certainly they have that today. California, if not for the 65 Act, would still be a center-right state, not a right-wing state, but a center-right state that would be generally Republican right now. It would be sort of like Florida, actually, very similar. So this is a fascinating thing, the 65 Act. It brought so many people here from so many different parts of the world, and they were able to bring their families, and they came without any expectation, really, of adapting to local customs because they were entering a country, to be fair, which was very fractured, especially by the civil rights era. And so many of them came that they could just establish parallel societies during the ensuing decades. And these folks looked at the Democratic Party as the party that let them in and the party that supports welfare for them, provided they come legally. But, the children of illegals are anchor babies, so they get welfare too. And a lot of Democrats obviously want immigration amnesty, such as Joe Biden. And so the new immigrants overwhelmingly supported the Democrats because they saw the Democrats as the party of their interests, and they saw the Republicans as the white party, not necessarily the Anglo party as the white ethnics viewed it, but as the white party. And that's because there was the consolidation of white support among the Republican ranks, which the Democrats feared. It took a while, but you really saw it coming into view after the glimmer of 64. It came into view big time in 68. And with Reagan, it became something undeniable. And with Trump, it's something that is the backbone of the GOP, this sort of pan-white Republican coalition. Although it is beginning to become more minority-oriented now, particularly over the last 4 years. And that's because a lot of minorities have not benefited from mass immigration themselves. Really, that's the core issue. And America has been dragged leftward on a host of issues that seem to have nothing to do with immigration because the demographics changed and the political power was had for radical change in terms of social mores, economics, things that you would not look at and say, wow, this pertains to immigration. They do in an indirect sense. It's because as the demographics change, the political, economic, and social destiny of the country changes as well. And that pertains to basically anything and everything you can imagine.
Gosh, this is so absolutely stimulating. And we're moving in here now, and we can see, I think, and folks, if you're not quite catching on, get Joseph's book and go back through these two interviews, and you can see the ingredients for all of the problems just prior to those problems existing. You can see how each step along the way led to the next. And we come to the final chapter in your book. In the face of this mounting crisis, the American people have been left to grapple with the consequences of long, misguided immigration policies. From 1960 to 2020, the racial demographic makeup of the United States underwent significant transformations. And I wonder if you might, in the final 8 or so minutes that we have with you today, and folks, we're definitely going to have Joseph back in the future, so no worries. And I'm going to be appearing with him hopefully this coming week. And so you'll be able to find me over there with another stimulating conversation. But I wonder if you might explore for us and explain how the inflection point of the 1960s, 1965 Immigration Act, Fair Housing Act, Voting Rights Act, the chain migration that you were mentioning that Kennedy had been for, the affinity between ethnic groups against the both white and non-white ethnic groups against the WASPs of the United States, and the perceptions of the political parties and how that slowly became what it was and is changing. I wonder if you might build together what you have in this final chapter of the book and what we see today. Are we seeing the apotheosis? Are we reaching the conclusion of these decisions that we've seen, this set of dominoes falling with disastrous decisions and conclusions over the course of this country's very short history?
Well, I have to read a bit of the chapter just to talk about the demographic transformation. In 1960, white Americans constituted approximately 85% of the population, with Black Americans making up around 10%. Over the subsequent decades, the percentage of white Americans gradually declined, reaching around 60% by 2020, while the Black population remained relatively stable in terms of percentage. Meanwhile, the Hispanic population saw a remarkable increase, rising from about 4% in 1960 to approximately 18% by 2020, becoming the largest minority group. The Oriental population also experienced substantial growth, expanding from less than 1% in 1960 to around 6% by 2020. Additionally, there has been a rise in individuals identifying as multiracial, reflecting a more complex and diverse racial landscape. Now, that's not all. A very interesting report came out this year, and I was able to include it in the book, from the Center for Immigration Studies, which is a brilliant outlet. Reading from the book, what I wrote about it, the population of foreign-born individuals residing in the U.S. soared to a staggering 51.6 million in March 2024, marking a historic high and comprising 15.6% of the nation's total population. The report, capturing the pulse of America's demographic evolution, unveiled a remarkable surge of 5.1 million new foreign-born residents between March 2022 and March 2024, constituting the most substantial two-year increase ever recorded in American history. Now, what does this all amount to? Well, going back about 10 years now, crazy as it might sound, it was 10 years ago, the Center for Immigration Studies did another study. What else? And it found that federal figures spanning 2000 to 2014 reveal a troubling fact. Immigrants, both lawful and unlawful, exclusively took in all net job increases among working-aged individuals aged 16 to 65. The CIS dove into Uncle Sam's data, making it public friendly. What was discovered should be especially worrying when considering the interests of native-born Americans, who constituted 2/3 of the growth in the total working age population during this era, which is to say 2000, 2014, yet all net job increases between those 16 to 65 went to immigrants. It's a very serious thing. It means that the economic growth of immigration, while it looks good on paper, is in fact not being, the people who are already here are not reaping the benefits of immigrants coming and creating economic activity. It's the old rule that not all growth is good growth. But looking beyond economics, in the epilogue, I wrote about another study, this one done by Robert Putnam of Harvard University, which I find particularly interesting. It is something that, for unsurprising reasons, does not get the sort of attention it deserves. In his 2000, right, reading from the book, of course, in Robert Putnam's 2006 Jonathan Skytte Prize Lecture, he articulated a sobering reality. Diverse communities often witness a retreat from collective engagement, a pervasive sense of distrust towards neighbors regardless of race, and a decline in social participation across various spheres. Putnam's research paints a bleak picture. Diversity, he discovered, leads individuals to withdraw from not just community activities, but also interpersonal relationships, fostering a culture of suspicion and disengagement. People in diverse areas are less likely to volunteer, donate to charity, or participate in civic projects. They exhibit lower rates of voter registration and harbor diminished belief in their ability to affect positive change. Instead of vibrant communal life, diversity seems to breed social isolation, leaving individuals to cocoon themselves in front of screens, disenchanted with the world outside. Yet what sets Putnam apart is his rigorous commitment to disentangling causation from correlation. He acknowledges the myriad of factors at play in diverse communities beyond just ethnic composition: size, mobility, inequality, and crime rates, to name a few. Recognizing the complexity of the issue, Putnam insists on statistical controls to avoid misleading conclusions. His approach underscores the gravity of the situation. Diversity's impact on trust is not a simplistic tale, but one entangled with multifaceted social dynamics. In the backdrop of Putnam's findings looms a disconcerting reality. America finds itself mired in deep pessimism. A January 2023 NBC News poll revealed a staggering 71% of Americans believing the nation is veering off course, something well in alignment with other surveys about the subject matter. This prolonged spell of despondency surpasses previous historical junctures of economic turmoil. Not even the recessions of 1992 or 2008 elicited such sustained pessimism. Despite the cyclical nature of elections offering hope for renewal, the landscape remains bleak, defying expectations of a reset. Republican pollster Bill McInturff aptly summarizes the prevailing sentiment. The anticipated rejuvenation following elections remains elusive. I'll stop reading that there, and I will skip to the afterword. This is, I'll read actually the final words of the book, which are not my own. They are from someone else, a sociologist who I referenced earlier in the book. His name is Edward Allsworth Ross, a fascinating man who wrote so much about American society in the early 1900s. What I'm about to read was written by him in 1912 in a scholarly journal about economics. And he hypothesized when immigration to America might reach its natural conclusion. He wrote, "Already America has ceased to allure, as of yore, the British. When immigration has ceased of itself, when the dogma, the sacred right of immigration has wrought its perfect work, and when the blood of the old pioneering breed has faded out of the motley, polyglot, polychrome, caste-driven population that will crowd this continent to a Chinese density, let there be reared a commemorative monument bearing these words: to the American pioneering breed, the victim of too much humanitarianism and too little common sense." I could not have put it any better than Ross. When I found his quote, I knew I had to include it here in the book. It was almost really prophetic. So this is, obviously there's a hell of a lot more in the book to read. I've skipped over the vast majority of it, as has Jason, of course, but people can certainly understand the subject matter I address and why I find it to be so important, why I think it's so consequential, why people should read what I've written and expose others to it. It's basically about waking people up to the history that got us to our present point and making us wonder about what the future has in store, rather than, sitting around on the computer all day, doing what happens in a diverse society, going onto social media, clicking on entertaining figures who claim to be political swamis of sorts, interacting with people in a shouting match that doesn't really go anywhere, watching live streams from certain individuals who I will not name that claim to be in favor of, shall we say, foundational American interests, but in reality, they're just advancing their own interests. And people really need to cut off this crap. They need to knock off the nonsense and understand the history so they can proactively deal with their present and build something positive for the future, because the future is most certainly not looking bright. And I will say one thing about individualism. America has always been a place for people who want individualism. It attracts people who tend to be more self-directed, than the norm wherever they're from. But the context of individualism changed so much in America between the old and the new immigration. In the days of the old immigration, it was individualism within the context of doing what you want in a society with a certain culture, with a certain history, with a certain heritage, to become a part of that society, and you live your dream there. The new immigration, the American dream, since this wave of immigration came to pass, is about making as much money as you can, dog eat dog world, getting to the top, climbing the greasy pole, and basically being as belligerent as possible. And he who has the most toys wins. A very different version of individualism from the old immigration iteration of it.
Very sage words. Beautiful, wrapping it up beautifully. And folks, do purchase Joseph's book. First chance you get, you're going to find a lot more information in there. We've just, in these 2 interviews, just touched the surface. We've skipped along the surface like throwing a stone across the lake. Going with that analogy, the lake is much deeper than you'll find in the conversation we had here. But Joseph's absolutely right. We have a lot of these entertainers who present themselves as political swarmies, as know-it-alls and socio-political ideologues that are absolutely superficial and interested in only promoting themselves, not addressing where we are today, how we got here, which is an important important knowledge, so that we don't repeat it in our attempt to try to remedy the situation that we find ourselves in. And it's quite dire, but we can still pull out the victory from the jaws of defeat. Joseph, it's been magnificent, and we're going to absolutely have you back again. And I'm looking forward to coming over on your channel and having a great conversation about Donald Trump and using anti-white and anti-whiteism and the spread of the lexicon. Would you please let folks know in the description, everyone, you can find, whether you're listening live or in replay, you can find Joseph's contacts. But please, if you would please let folks know where they can find you and what you might be addressing next. I know you have a long list of topics that you want to be covering in your future streams. And then we will let you go, and we will continue on for the evening.
Certainly. Well, first and foremost, thank you for inviting me on, Jason. I'm looking forward to speaking with you again here, as well as, of course, on my program. And thank you to everyone who tuned in to hear my thoughts. People can find me on Twitter, or X as it's now called, just at Joseph Ford Cotto, Cotto. If you just type Joseph Ford Cotto into the search bar, it should come right up. I have the blue check mark. And people can see the show I host news site, which is about what else? Insight on important news items. There are quite a lot of episodes and quite a few that have been live streamed, but I've yet to heavily promote them because there's a backlog. But people will see different episodes each day highlighted on my Twitter feed, and they certainly can learn a lot about what's going on, things that, to put mildly, cable news would not cover. And people can buy the book at Amazon. They just type in "What Happened to America." It should come right up. And people can, I strongly recommend that they follow me on Twitter, because they'll obviously be notified about new episodes of the show through the notifications tab. But they can also subscribe to News Site on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. The show gets hardly any listens there. It's really a video show on Twitter, but people, if it's inconvenient for them to watch, they can always just listen as a podcast. It takes a while for it to show up there, but it does show up there in time. And Jason, thank you very much for having me on once again. Outstanding conversation. No conversation can go well if the interviewer does not know his stuff, and you, needless to say, do. So really, really great discussion, and I'm looking forward to further discourses.
God bless you, man. Really appreciate you and all the work that you are doing. And folks, the link for Joseph's book, What Happened to America, is in the description below. And 10 seconds, we'll be right back. Bye-bye, brother.
Have a good one.